The dining hall of the Whitmore plantation glowed like a jewel box beneath the illumination of 200 candles. Imported crystal chandeliers from France scattered dancing shadows across walls that were draped in white silk. The length of the room was occupied by 3 long tables, each covered in Irish linen and weighed down by silver platters containing more food than the 67 enslaved individuals on the property would witness in an entire month. Roasted duck shimmered with honey glaze. Thick venison steaks, seared to absolute perfection, were positioned beside mounds of buttered asparagus, sweet potato pies, pyramids of cornbread, fruit preserves in cut crystal bowls, and positioned at the very center sat a 4-layer wedding cake decorated with sugar flowers so delicate they appeared almost real. The room was filled with over 120 guests, their laughter swelling and receding like ocean waves. Women wearing gowns of emerald silk and sapphire taffeta fanned themselves with delicate movements, their jewelry capturing the light with every gesture. Men wearing tailored suits gathered in clusters, holding cigars, discussing cotton prices and political matters with the effortless confidence characteristic of people who had never once questioned their position in the world. At the head table sat Cornelius Whitmore, 31 years of age, his countenance flushed from whiskey and accomplishment, and alongside him sat his new bride, Elizabeth Cunningham, pale and flawless in her white wedding gown that had cost more than 3 enslaved people combined. The enslaved individuals moved throughout the celebration like apparitions, silent and unseen despite occupying every space. They carried silver trays, decanted wine, removed plates, retrieved additional food, adjusted seating, collected fallen napkins, and endured verbal abuse with the identical vacant expressions they wore when enduring physical blows. A young girl, no more than 7 years old, knelt at Judge Cunningham's feet, polishing his footwear while he dined, her small fingers moving the cloth in careful circular motions. Nobody acknowledged her presence. Nobody expressed gratitude. She existed purely as a function, not as a child. Elias, the head cook, positioned himself near the kitchen entrance, observing. His countenance revealed nothing, though his hands concealed within the folds of his apron were clenched into fists so tight his knuckles had turned white. Beside him, Samuel held a wine bottle. The liquid within was dark as blood. Their eyes connected momentarily across the space. Something unspoken traveled between them. Something final. The musicians performed, the guests danced, the candles diminished. And as midnight drew near, as the celebration achieved its pinnacle of joy and excess, none of the white individuals in that luminous room possessed any awareness that they were experiencing the final hours of their existence. Before we proceed with this narrative of vengeance, remember to subscribe to the channel and indicate in the comments which city you're listening from. Thank you, and let's continue. 3 weeks earlier, March 26, 1859, the announcement arrived on a Sunday morning, delivered with the casual brutality that characterized every aspect of existence on the Whitmore plantation. Cornelius Whitmore positioned himself on the veranda of the main house, holding Bourbon despite the early hour, and addressed the 67 human beings he possessed as if they were cattle being readied for market. On April 16th, "I'm marrying Miss Elizabeth Cunningham," he proclaimed, his voice projecting across the yard where the enslaved individuals stood in silent formation. "Her father is Judge Cunningham of Montgomery. My guests will include senators, plantation owners, businessmen, the most prominent individuals in Alabama. This wedding will therefore be flawless. This means all of you will labor more intensely than you've ever labored in your miserable existences to guarantee I suffer no humiliation." He stopped to consume some whiskey, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces with the detached curiosity of someone examining implements. Any errors, any indolence, any indication that you fail to comprehend your position, and I'll ensure you regret your existence. Is that understood? Silence. The enslaved individuals had learned long ago that responding was equally as hazardous as not responding. Any response could be interpreted as insolence. Whitmore smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. Good. Pike will assign your duties. Begin working. Pike, the head overseer, was a stocky, thick individual with a perpetually flushed face and small, malicious eyes. He carried a coiled whip on his belt that he employed with enthusiasm and imagination. As Whitmore retreated inside the house, Pike moved forward and started reading from a document, his voice monotone and matter of fact, as though he were assigning chores rather than dictating 3 weeks of torment. Elias, you're responsible for all food preparation. I expect a menu by tomorrow morning. Sarah, Clara, Ruth, and Bessie, you'll clean the main house thoroughly. Every chamber, every corner, every piece of silver and crystal. Margaret and Delia, you'll manage the linens and tablecloths. They must be white as snow, no stains, no creases. Samuel, Josiah, James, and Benjamin, you'll repair all fencing, whitewash the house exterior, construct additional seating, and maintain the grounds. The gardens must resemble something from a painting. He proceeded through the list, assigning every man, woman, and child a function in creating the spectacle that would commemorate Cornelius, Whitmore's acquisition of new property, his wife. Even the youngest were given tasks. 7-year-old Lily and 9-year-old Thomas would polish every pair of footwear belonging to every guest. 6-year-old Jacob would transport water. 5-year-old Mary would assist in the kitchen, standing on a stool to reach the surfaces, her small hands already marked with scars from previous burns. When Pike finished, he surveyed the assembled enslaved individuals with something approaching contentment. You have 21 days. The master demands perfection. You'll work from sunrise to well past sunset. Food allowances will be decreased. Can't have you becoming plump and idle when there's labor to complete. Anyone unable to maintain pace will face consequences. Anyone who complains will face consequences. Anyone who merely appears to be contemplating, causing trouble will face consequences. Now move. The enslaved individuals scattered to their assignments, and the ordeal commenced. Sarah, at 34, had already entered 2 children and a husband on Whitmore land. She had been born on this plantation, as had her mother before her. She knew every inch of the main house, had cleaned every room countless times. But Whitmore's wedding demanded something beyond simple cleanliness. It demanded the elimination of any indication that human beings lived and labored there. It demanded the illusion that wealth and beauty simply materialized spontaneously, without the blood and sweat that actually generated them. She began in the master bedroom, where Cornelius Whitmore slept in a 4-poster bed imported from England, while enslaved individuals slept on wooden planks in cabins that leaked during rainfall. The room had to be flawless for when he brought his new bride home. Sarah scrubbed floors that were already clean, polished furniture that already gleamed, washed windows until her arms ached. When Elizabeth Cunningham arrived 3 days later to supervise preparations, she swept through the room, ran a gloved finger along a window ledge, and discovered a microscopic trace of dust. "Are you incompetent or merely lazy?" Elizabeth inquired, her tone cutting like broken glass. She was 23 years old. Beautiful in the manner of women who had never performed a day's labor in their existence, and already proficient in the particular cruelty that Southern white women inflicted on enslaved women. "I apologize, ma'am," Sarah whispered, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I'll clean it again." "You'll clean this entire room again, and if I discover another particle of dust, I'll have Pike instruct you on the meaning of thoroughness." Sarah cleaned the room repeatedly over the following 3 days, until Elizabeth finally declared it satisfactory. By then Sarah's hands were raw, her back screamed with agony, and she had slept perhaps 6 hours in total. But the room was prepared for its new mistress. In the kitchen, Elias confronted an impossible task. Cornelius Whitmore desired a feast that would impress the wealthiest individuals in Alabama. Roasted duck, venison, ham glazed with honey and cloves, 3 varieties of pie, biscuits, cornbread, preserves, and a 4-layer wedding cake. All of this had to be prepared with limited ingredients in a kitchen designed for feeding a household, not catering a massive celebration. And it had to be accomplished while the regular work of feeding the enslaved individuals and the white family continued. Elias was 58 years old. He had been cooking since age 8 when his mother, the previous head cook, began teaching him the recipes she had transported from Africa, transformed through decades of slavery into something new and southern. He knew how to make anything taste good, even the scraps and discards considered appropriate food for enslaved people. But this wedding would demand skills and resources he barely had access to. His crew consisted of 7 women and 2 boys, all of whom already worked full days. Now they would work 18-hour days, starting at 300 a.m. and finishing well after dark. Delia, at 19, was the youngest of the women. Her hands were covered in scars from burns. The stove had marked her since she was 12 years old, when she first started working in the kitchen. Margaret, at 42, had a persistent cough that worsened annually from smoke inhalation. But neither of them would be permitted to rest, to recover, to be anything other than perfectly productive. On the 3rd day of preparations, young Lily dropped a bowl while carrying it to the washing area. It shattered on the stone floor, pieces scattering. Before anyone could react, Pike materialized in the doorway. He must have been observing, waiting for precisely this type of mistake. "What did you just do?" His voice was quiet, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he'd been shouting. Lily, 7 years old, began to cry. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry. It slipped. I didn't intend to. I'm sorry." Pike grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging into her thin limb with sufficient force to leave bruises. "Master Whitmore is investing good money in this wedding. You think he wants clumsy little vermin breaking his property?" "Please, sir." Delia stepped forward, her voice trembling. "She's merely a child. It was an accident. I'll accept her punishment." Pike's smile was unpleasant. "You'll accept your own punishment for speaking out of turn, but she'll still receive hers. You people need to understand that errors carry consequences." He dragged Lily outside into the yard. The other enslaved individuals working on their various tasks stopped and observed in silence. They understood what was coming. Pike extracted his whip, and while a 7-year-old girl sobbed and pleaded, he struck her 3 times across the back. The blows weren't as severe as they would have been for an adult. Pike knew better than to damage a child so severely she couldn't work. But they were severe enough to leave welts severe enough to make her scream. When it concluded, Pike pushed her toward the kitchen. "Return to work, all of you, and let this serve as a lesson about being careful with the master's property." That night, in the slave quarters, Delia held Lily while the child cried herself to sleep. The welts on her back had been treated with a salve that old Moses, who served as the closest thing the enslaved individuals had to a healer, had mixed from herbs, but the physical wounds would heal faster than the psychological ones. Lily had learned, as every enslaved child eventually learned, that her pain held no significance for the people who owned her, that her tears were at best an annoyance and at worst entertainment. "I despise them," Delia whispered into the darkness. "I despise them so intensely." In another cabin, Samuel lay beside his wife Martha and their 3 children. He'd spent the day constructing additional seating for the wedding guests, benches that would accommodate the wealthy white people who would come to celebrate Cornelius Whitmore's happiness, while disregarding the misery of the people who made that happiness achievable. His hands were covered in splinters, his muscles ached, and he'd been granted only one brief interval to drink water during the entire day. "How much longer can we endure existence like this?" he asked Martha, his voice scarcely audible. Martha stroked his hair, her touch gentle, despite her own exhaustion from working in the cotton fields all day. "As long as we must, as long as it maintains our survival, as long as it maintains our children's survival. But what kind of existence is this? What kind of future do they have?" Martha had no response. What response existed? Their children would mature to become enslaved individuals just as they had matured to become enslaved individuals, just as their parents before them had been enslaved individuals. The system was designed to be perpetual, unbreakable, an iron chain extending from the past into an endless future. But Samuel, lying in the darkness, perceived something shifting within him. A fury that had been simmering for years was beginning to boil. He didn't possess words for it yet, didn't possess a plan. But he knew with sudden certainty that he couldn't continue existing like this indefinitely, that at some point something would inevitably shatter. The days merged into an endless cycle of labor and exhaustion. Sarah and her crew cleaned the main house with obsessive attention to detail, understanding that any imperfection would result in punishment. They scrubbed floors until their knees bled through their thin garments. They polished silver until their fingers cramped. They washed windows until the glass became invisible. And when Elizabeth Cunningham inspected their work, she always discovered something wrong. A chair positioned an inch too far from the table. A candlestick that wasn't perfectly aligned. A mirror displaying a tiny smudge in the corner. Each imperfection resulted in punishment. Sometimes a slap, sometimes a whipping, sometimes being denied food for a day. The cruelty was capricious and arbitrary, designed not to correct actual mistakes, but to reinforce the fundamental truth of their existence. They were property, not people, and their owners' whims were law. Clara, who worked alongside Sarah, was 40 years old. She had been pregnant 8 times in her life. 3 of those pregnancies ended in miscarriages from overwork. 2 of her children died before their 5th birthdays from illness that could have been treated if enslaved individuals had been permitted access to proper medical care. Her surviving son was Isaiah, 16 years old, who worked in the fields alongside the men, despite still being a boy. Every day she feared that he would do or say something that would result in his death. Young men were the most dangerous enslaved individuals to own from the master's perspective, because young men possessed pride and anger that hadn't yet been beaten out of them. One afternoon, while Clara was cleaning the library, she discovered a book lying open on Cornelius Whitmore's desk. She couldn't read. Teaching enslaved individuals to read was prohibited in Alabama, but she recognized the book as a Bible. It was open to a passage that Whitmore had underlined. "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ." Clara stared at those words she couldn't read, understanding somehow what they conveyed. Understanding that white people employed them to justify the unjustifiable. Understanding that the same God who supposedly commanded her submission was the same God she prayed to every night for deliverance. The contradiction was crushing. If God existed and was benevolent, how could he permit this? If God existed and commanded her enslavement, how could he be benevolent? She closed the book gently and continued cleaning. But something within her hardened that day. Whatever God existed, if he existed at all, he wasn't going to rescue them. If they desired salvation, they would have to rescue themselves. By April 10th, 6 days before the wedding, the preparations had reached an intense peak. The enslaved individuals now worked 20-hour days, collapsing into their cabins for a few hours of unconsciousness before being roused again before dawn. Children fell asleep standing upright. Adults moved through their duties like automatons, their minds shutting down to protect themselves from the endless grind. In the kitchen, Elias and his crew prepared increasingly elaborate dishes, following Elizabeth's demanding specifications. She desired everything to be flawless, to surpass the expectations of guests who were accustomed to the finest items money could purchase. The irony was suffocating. These guests would arrive in their elegant carriages and expensive attire, would consume food prepared by people who were starving, would be served by people who were beaten for the slightest error, and would never for a moment question the morality of the system that made their comfort possible. On April 12th, 4 days before the wedding, the first guests began arriving. They came from Montgomery, from Selma, from Mobile, from plantations throughout Alabama. They were lawyers and judges, plantation owners and their wives, businessmen who traded in cotton and in human flesh. They came with servants of their own, adding another 24 enslaved people to the population of the plantation, all of whom had to be fed and housed and managed. The visiting enslaved individuals were housed in the already overcrowded quarters, sleeping on floors, because sufficient beds didn't exist. The visiting white people were given the finest rooms in the main house, their luggage carried by men who owned nothing but the clothes on their backs. And every single one of them, visitors and residents alike, treated the presence of enslaved people with the same casual disregard they would give to furniture or livestock. Sarah, carrying fresh linens to one of the guest rooms, encountered Judge Cunningham in the hallway. He was Elizabeth's father, a large man with white mutton chops and an air of pompous self-importance. He didn't move aside to permit Sarah passage. Instead, he positioned himself in the center of the hall, forcing her to press herself against the wall to navigate around him. "That's correct, girl," he remarked conversationally, as if commenting on the weather. "Understand your position. Remain out of the path of your superiors." Sarah maintained her downward gaze and murmured, "Yes, sir." But internally, a voice she'd been suppressing for 34 years whispered, "You are not my superior. You are not superior to me. You are simply someone who possesses the authority to harm me, and I lack the authority to prevent you. But authority and worth are not identical concepts." She didn't know the origin of that voice, didn't know what to do with it. But once awakened, it refused to be silenced. That evening, after another punishing day of labor, a small gathering formed in the shadows between the cabins. Elias, Samuel, Clara, Sarah, Old Moses, young Isaiah, and Delia. 7 individuals who had reached a breaking point. They spoke in whispers, their words barely perceptible above the sounds of the night. "We cannot continue like this," Samuel said, his voice taut with exhaustion and fury. 3 more days of this, and some of us will die simply from the labor. And then what? They replace us with new enslaved individuals and existence continues. What alternative do we possess? Clara inquired, but her voice lacked conviction. Elias, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "There's always an alternative. We've simply been too terrified to select it." "What kind of alternative?" Isaiah asked eagerly. At 16, he still believed that resistance was possible, that they weren't completely powerless. Elias examined each of them sequentially, assessing their determination. "The kind of alternative that can't be reversed," The kind that means we either achieve freedom or we perish. But either way, we cease being enslaved individuals. The silence that ensued was profound. They all understood what he was suggesting, even if he hadn't articulated it explicitly. They all understood that on April 16th, over 100 white people would assemble in the main house for a celebration. They all understood that those people would consume food prepared in the kitchen, would drink wine poured by enslaved hands, would spend hours in a state of revelry and inattention. They all understood that poisoning them would be straightforward. "They'll execute us," Delia whispered. "Even if we flee, they'll pursue us and execute us." "They're executing us currently," Samuel countered, "simply slowly over years and decades rather than all at once." "What's the distinction?" "The distinction is hope," Clara said. "As long as we're alive, there's hope that circumstances might change, that perhaps our children might witness freedom even if we don't." "Hope," Sarah repeated, and the word tasted bitter in her mouth. "I possessed hope. I hoped my children would survive. They didn't. I hoped my husband would survive. He didn't. I hoped Elizabeth Cunningham would demonstrate a fragment of human decency. She hasn't. Hope is a luxury we can no longer afford." Old Moses, who at 73 had witnessed more suffering than all of them combined, finally spoke. His voice was soft, but carried absolute certainty. "I've existed my entire life anticipating God's deliverance, anticipating white people developing a conscience, anticipating the world becoming just, and I'm still anticipating, still enslaved, still treated like an animal. I'm exhausted from anticipating. If I'm going to perish, and I will soon, these aged bones won't endure much longer. Then I desire to perish having retaliated. Just once. Just one time before I depart. I want them to understand that we're not merely victims. That we can bite back." The decision wasn't reached that night. It couldn't be. Something so momentous required time to process, to accept, to commit to. But the seed was planted. Over the following 3 days, as they labored themselves to exhaustion, preparing for Cornelius Whitmore's wedding, that seed germinated in the darkness of their anger and despair. On April 15th, the day preceding the wedding, Elias reached his final decision. He possessed a wooden box, small and unremarkable, concealed beneath the floorboards of his cabin. His mother had given it to him 40 years ago, and her mother had given it to her. Inside were dried roots of a plant that grew in the swamps. A plant whose properties had been recognized in Africa and had been preserved in the memories of enslaved people who employed them sometimes as medicine, sometimes as escape from unbearable pain, and sometimes as a weapon. "If they push you too far," his mother had whispered on her deathbed, "remember that the swamp provides. Remember that our ancestors possessed knowledge the white people have forgotten." Clear's throat. "Remember that you always have a choice, even if the choice is only between different forms of death." Elias retrieved the box and opened it, examining the contents. The roots were aged, but properly dried. They would endure for years. He understood how to prepare them. Understood that when mixed with water and spices, they could be rendered nearly flavorless. Understood that when consumed in sufficient quantities, they would induce permanent sleep, peacefully, without agony or struggle. He sat with that box in his lap for hours, contemplating the magnitude of what he was considering. He wasn't a murderer, wasn't a violent man. He was a cook, someone who had spent his existence creating nourishment and comfort through food. But he was also a man who had interred 3 children and a wife, who had observed countless others suffer and perish, who had been beaten and humiliated and dehumanized every single day for 58 years. And he was exhausted. Not merely physically exhausted, though God knows he was that, but soul exhausted. Exhausted by the weight of injustice, by the impossibility of the situation. by the understanding that regardless of how diligently he labored or how obedient he was, he would perish enslaved and be buried in an unmarked grave and forgotten. That evening he sought out the 6 others. They gathered in the kitchen after midnight. When the house was finally quiet, when Pike and the other overseers had retreated to their own quarters, Elias positioned the wooden box on the table and informed them what it contained. "Tomorrow night," he said quietly, "we have a decision to make. We can serve them their feast as we always do, smile when they expect us to smile, endure their abuse, observe them celebrate while we suffer. And then the day after we return to being enslaved individuals, we continue being enslaved individuals until we perish." Or he didn't complete the sentence. He didn't need to. They all comprehended. "How many?" Samuel inquired. "All of them," Elias stated. "Every guest, everyone in that dining hall. If we do this, we do it completely. No witnesses, no survivors to recount the tale. And then we flee. We take whatever advantage we can obtain and we flee north." "We'll never succeed," Clara said, but her voice carried no conviction. "Probably not," Elias agreed. "Probably they'll capture us and hang us, but at minimum we'll have attempted. At minimum we'll have made our own decision for once." The vote, when it occurred, was unanimous. 7 individuals, broken by a lifetime of slavery, selected the slim possibility of freedom over the certainty of continued bondage. They selected to risk everything for the opportunity, however small, of determining their own destiny. April 16, 1859 arrived with a dawn that appeared more cruel than usual, as if the sun itself was mocking them with its indifferent beauty. The sky blazed pink and gold above the cotton fields, and birds sang in the trees, oblivious to the significance of the day. By 300 a.m., every enslaved person on the plantation had been awakened from whatever brief sleep they'd managed. There was no time for breakfast, no time for anything except immediate labor. The wedding would commence at 400 p.m., and there remained 1,000 tasks to complete. Elias entered the kitchen alone, an hour before anyone else would arrive. His hands were steady as he ignited the fire in the large stove, as he positioned a small pot of water to boil on a back burner, where it wouldn't be noticed. From inside his shirt, he withdrew the wooden box. The dried roots inside appeared harmless, like ordinary herbs that might be employed for seasoning. But Elias understood their true nature. His mother had taught him how to identify the plant in the swamp, how to harvest it at the appropriate time of year, how to dry and preserve it. She had also taught him the proper proportions. Insufficient quantity would merely make someone ill. Excessive quantity would be obviously suspicious. The amount had to be precise. He dropped the roots into the boiling water and observed as they slowly released their essence. The liquid transformed to a dark amber color and began emitting a bitter, acrid smell. Elias added honey to mask the scent, then a combination of spices, cinnamon, clove, a touch of nutmeg. The smell transformed into something almost pleasant like mulled wine. He allowed it to simmer for 30 minutes, then strained the liquid through cheesecloth into a ceramic container. The result was approximately 2 quarts of concentrated poison when appeared like nothing more than a dark syrup. When Delia arrived at 400 a.m., her eyes immediately went to the container on the counter. Elias met her gaze and nodded once. She closed her eyes briefly, as if uttering a prayer, then fastened her apron and commenced her work. One by one, the others arrived. Margaret, Bessie, the 2 young boys who assisted with heavy lifting. None of them inquired about the container. They all comprehended its significance. They had each made their decision the previous night, and now they simply had to follow through. The morning passed in a frenzy of cooking. Ducks were roasted until their skin crackled and glistened. Venison was seared and seasoned with herbs from the garden. Ham was glazed with honey and studded with cloves. Sweet potatoes were mashed with butter and brown sugar. Cornbread was baked in large iron skillets. Pies were assembled. Pecan, apple, sweet potato. And throughout it all, Elias worked with mechanical precision, his mind curiously calm. He had crossed a threshold in his thinking. Whatever would happen would happen. He had made peace with it. At noon, he began preparing the wine. There were dozens of bottles to be served, French wines that Cornelius Whitmore had imported at enormous expense to impress his guests. Elias selected 3 bottles of the darkest red wine, uncorked them, and carefully poured an ounce of the prepared liquid into each bottle. He swirled them gently to incorporate the contents, then marked the bottles with a small scratch on the label, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. These 3 bottles would be served exclusively to the white guests. The enslaved people serving them would recognize which bottles to pour from. As evening approached, the main house transformed. Every surface gleamed. Flowers from the garden adorned every room. The dining hall had been arranged with precision. Each piece of silver perfectly aligned, each glass sparkling, each plate positioned exactly 1 inch from the edge of the table. The wedding cake stood in magnificent glory on a side table. 4 layers of white perfection, decorated with sugar flowers that had required Bessie 3 days to create. Everything was prepared for the celebration of Cornelius Whitmore's marriage to Elizabeth Cunningham. At 4 p.m., the ceremony commenced in the front parlor. A minister from Montgomery, a thin man with a voice resembling a funeral bell, stood before the assembled guests and intoned the sacred words that would bind Cornelius and Elizabeth in holy matrimony. The enslaved individuals were lined up along the walls, required to observe their master's happiness. They stood silent and motionless, their faces carefully expressionless, while the white people in the room smiled and dabbed at their eyes with lace handkerchiefs. Sarah, positioned near the back, observed Elizabeth in her white wedding gown and experienced nothing but a cold, distant anger. This woman, who would now become mistress of the plantation, had demonstrated over the previous weeks to be even more cruel than Cornelius. She derived pleasure from discovering faults, from ordering punishments, from reminding the enslaved individuals at every opportunity that they were beneath her notice, except as objects of her displeasure. And now she stood there, beautiful and radiant, receiving congratulations from guests who perceived nothing wrong with a world where her wedding required the suffering of 67 human beings. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the guests erupted in applause. The enslaved individuals did not applaud. They were not required to. They were simply required to be present, to be witnesses, to serve as reminders of the groom's wealth and status. After all, a man who owned 67 enslaved individuals was clearly prosperous. A man who could command such flawless service was clearly powerful. The enslaved individuals themselves, as individuals, were irrelevant. They were merely props in someone else's narrative. The reception commenced immediately following the ceremony. Guests moved from the parlor to the dining hall, exclaiming over the decorations, the flowers, the elaborate table settings. They occupied their seats while the enslaved individuals emerged from the kitchen carrying the first course, a delicate soup made from spring vegetables. As they served, moving silently between the tables, the guests conversed and laughed as if the servants were furniture. "I declare, Cornelius," Judge Cunningham boomed, his voice carrying across the room, "you've done well for yourself. A beautiful bride, a profitable plantation, and clearly you understand how to manage your property." He gestured vaguely at the enslaved individuals serving the soup. "Well trained, these ones, unlike some plantations where the Negroes are uppity and require constant correction. Cornelius smiled with pride. I believe in firm discipline, Your Honor. These people need to comprehend their position. Too many owners are lenient, and that's when you experience runaways and rebellion. But treat them with appropriate strictness, and they'll serve faithfully. The irony of those words, spoken merely hours before his death, would have been amusing if the situation weren't so terrible. Clara, positioned close enough to hear, felt her hands tremble as she held a serving tray. Appropriate strictness. As if the beatings, the starvation rations, the endless labor, the separation of families, the casual cruelty were all somehow measured and reasonable responses to the crime of being born black. The meal progressed through multiple courses. Each dish was greeted with exclamations of delight from the guests. They complimented Cornelius on the quality of his kitchen staff, as if he had personally prepared the food rather than enslaved people who hadn't consumed a full meal in 3 weeks. When the roasted duck was served, Margaret Fairfax, wife of a prominent lawyer, actually clapped her hands together like a delighted child. "Oh, this appears divine," she gushed. "You absolutely must share your cook's recipe, Elizabeth, though I'm certain my people could never replicate it. They're competent enough, but they lack the natural rhythm that makes colored folk such excellent cooks." Elizabeth smiled graciously. "Of course, Margaret, though, I concur. There's something in their nature that makes them suited to this type of work. God created them for service after all." Samuel, positioned against the wall with a wine bottle in each hand, heard these words and felt something fracture within him. God created them for service, as if their enslavement was part of divine plan. As if their suffering was somehow ordained by heaven, as if the people consuming this feast possessed any moral justification for the system that permitted them to live in luxury, while others lived in chains. As the evening advanced, the wine flowed freely. Elias had positioned himself near the serving station, where the wine bottles were stored. He ensured that the marked bottles, the ones containing the poison, were the ones handed to Samuel, Isaiah, and the other servers. He ensured that every glass at the main tables was filled from those bottles. The guests drank deeply and often, their inhibitions diminishing as alcohol and arrogance combined to make them louder, cruder, more carelessly cruel. By 8:00 p.m., the dancing had commenced. Musicians, 3 enslaved men who played violin, banjo, and drums, provided entertainment, while the guests twirled and spun in the cleared center of the room. The enslaved individuals serving the party had to navigate around the dancers, attempting not to be knocked over while carrying heavy trays. At one point, a young boy named Thomas, 10 years old, was bumped by a dancing couple and nearly dropped a tray of glasses. He managed to steady it at the final moment, but the near accident captured Elizabeth's attention. She ceased dancing and glared at the child. "Clumsy little creature. Do you have any idea what those glasses cost?" "I apologize, ma'am," Thomas whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "The gentleman bumped me, ma'am. I didn't intend to. Are you implying my guest was at fault?" Elizabeth's tone was cold. "Are you blaming a white gentleman for your own incompetence?" "No, ma'am." "I apologize, ma'am." Elizabeth raised her hand as if to strike the child, then appeared to remember that she was wearing her wedding dress and didn't wish to soil it by touching an enslaved person. Instead, she gestured to Pike, who had been positioned near the door. "Take him outside and instruct him to be more careful. 5 lashes should suffice." The room fell silent momentarily as Pike seized Thomas by the arm and dragged him toward the door. The boy didn't cry out, didn't resist. He had learned that resistance only intensified punishments. But his face was white with terror. He was 10 years old and about to be whipped for the offense of nearly dropping glasses after being knocked by a careless dancer. Clara, Thomas's mother, stood frozen against the wall, unable to assist her son, unable to protect him, compelled to simply observe as he was removed to be beaten. Isaiah, positioned beside her, placed a hand on her arm. "Not much longer, Mama," he whispered so quietly only she could perceive. "Not much longer now." And it was accurate. By 9:00 p.m., subtle changes were beginning to manifest among the guests. Judge Cunningham complained of feeling warm and loosened his collar. Margaret Fairfax mentioned that the room appeared to be spinning slightly, though she dismissed it as having consumed too much wine. One of the musicians playing violin missed several notes, his coordination appearing impaired. These minor indicators went mostly unnoticed in the general revelry, dismissed as the normal effects of alcohol and rich food. By 10:00 p.m., the indicators were impossible to disregard. Judge Cunningham attempted to stand and immediately sat back down, his face pale. "I don't feel quite right," he said to no one in particular. Margaret Fairfax dropped her wine glass, and it shattered on the floor, red wine spreading across the polished wood like blood. She stared at it in confusion, as if unable to comprehend how it had occurred. The violinist ceased playing entirely and slumped forward over his instrument. Elizabeth, who had consumed less than most of the guests due to her duties as hostess, observed the spreading malaise and experienced a surge of alarm. "What's occurring? Is someone ill?" She surveyed the room and observed that nearly every guest was exhibiting signs of distress. Some were clutching their chests, breathing rapidly. Others appeared unable to focus their eyes. Several had slumped in their chairs, their heads lolling. Cornelius Whitmore, who had consumed more wine than anyone else in the room, attempted to stand and reassure his bride. "It's nothing, my dear. Perhaps the wine was spoiled or—" But his voice trailed off as his legs collapsed beneath him. He crashed to the floor, his expensive suit crumpling, his face transitioning from red to an alarming gray shade. Elizabeth screamed and dropped to her knees beside him. "Cornelius, someone assist him. Fetch the doctor." But even as she shouted, she perceived her own body beginning to betray her. The room tilted and swam. Her hands clutching at her husband's shoulder began to grow numb. She looked up at the enslaved individuals positioned along the walls and observed them watching with expression she couldn't quite interpret. Not shock, not fear, something different, something that appeared almost like satisfaction. "You," she gasped, staring at Elias, who stood near the kitchen entrance. "You did this. You poisoned us." Elias met her gaze steadily and remained silent. There was nothing to articulate. The truth was inscribed in the dying gasps of over 100 people, in the wine glasses scattered across the tables, in the decades of cruelty that had led inevitably to this moment. Elizabeth attempted to speak again, attempted to summon assistance, attempted to do anything, but her body was shutting down. She collapsed across Cornelius's chest, her white wedding dress spreading around her like a shroud, and within a minute, both bride and groom lay motionless. The silence that followed was profound. Throughout the dining hall, bodies slumped in chairs or lay sprawled on the floor. The musicians were quiet, their instruments fallen silent. The candles continued to burn, casting flickering light across a scene of perfect, terrible stillness. The feast remained on the tables, barely disturbed. The wedding cake stood intact, its sugar flowers still flawless. Everything was exactly as it had been planned, except that everyone intended to enjoy it was deceased. The enslaved individuals stood frozen for an extended moment, unable to fully comprehend what had just occurred. They had planned this, had chosen this, had understood it would happen. But witnessing it, Actually observing the death of over 100 people was different from imagining it. The magnitude of what they had done crashed over them like a wave. Clara began to weep silently, tears streaming down her face. Not for the people who had died. She possessed no tears remaining for them, but for what this signified, for what would follow, for the impossible choice they had made and the consequences they would confront. Young Isaiah placed his arm around his mother and held her while she cried. Delia stood staring at Elizabeth's body, at the woman who had tormented her for 3 weeks, who had derived pleasure from causing pain, who had been beautiful and cruel and utterly without mercy. Now she lay deceased in her wedding dress, having lived just long enough to comprehend that her victims had retaliated. Samuel surveyed the carnage and experienced something he hadn't anticipated. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but a profound, overwhelming weariness. "We need to depart," he said quietly, "immediately before anyone discovers this." His words shattered the spell. Elias nodded and turned to the others. "Everyone intending to come, assemble in the yard. Bring only what you can transport. Food, blankets, water. We leave in 10 minutes. The enslaved individuals dispersed rapidly, some to their cabins to gather their few possessions, others to the kitchen to collect food. Word spread swiftly through the quarters about what had occurred in the main house. The enslaved individuals who hadn't participated in the plot responded with shock and horror. Some desired to join the escape attempt. Others were too terrified to move, certain that fleeing would only worsen their eventual punishment. Ultimately, 23 individuals chose to flee. Elias, Samuel, Clara, Sarah, Isaiah, Delia, old Moses. Despite his earlier intention to remain behind, he changed his mind when the moment arrived, and 16 others, spanning in age from 5 to 60, the remaining 44 enslaved individuals remained behind. Some because they had young children they didn't believe could survive the journey. Some because they were too elderly or ill to travel. Some because they simply couldn't convince themselves that escape was achievable. Martha, Samuel's wife, stood in the doorway of their cabin with their 3 children clinging to her skirts. Samuel attempted one final time to persuade her to accompany them. "Please, Martha, we can succeed. We can reach the north. We can achieve freedom." But Martha shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I cannot risk the babies, Samuel. I cannot observe them perish in some swamp or be torn apart by dogs. At minimum here they're alive. At minimum here there's a possibility someone will purchase them and transport them somewhere better." Samuel recognized it was pointless to argue. He kissed his wife and children farewell, memorizing their faces, understanding he would never see them again. Then he turned and walked toward the group gathering in the yard, his heart fracturing but his determination firm. He had made his decision. Before departing, Sarah insisted on one final act of defiance. She re-entered the main house, stepping carefully around the bodies in the dining hall, and ascended the stairs to Cornelius Whitmore's study. There she discovered his ledger, the book where he recorded every enslaved person he owned, every purchase, every sale, every punishment. She carried it downstairs to the kitchen fireplace, where coals still glowed from the evening's cooking. One by one, she fed the pages to the fire, observing them curl and blacken and transform to ash. "No more records," she said quietly. "No more evidence that we were ever their property. Let us become ghosts. Let us become nothing but a mystery they can never unravel." At midnight, the 23 fugitives departed the Whitmore plantation. They moved silently through the darkness, avoiding the main road, cutting through the cotton fields toward the woods that bordered the northern edge of the property. The moon was a thin crescent, providing just sufficient light to see by, but not enough to render them easily visible. Behind them, The main house stood silent, its windows dark, its chambers occupied by the deceased. Ahead of them lay 200 miles of hostile territory and the impossible aspiration of freedom. They walked in silence, fear and adrenaline maintaining their movement despite their exhaustion. Every sound startled them. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through leaves, the snap of a twig beneath someone's foot. They anticipated at any moment to hear dogs, to hear shouts, to hear the crack of rifles. But the night remained quiet, and they made steady progress. By dawn, they had covered approximately 10 miles. Elias guided them to a dense thicket near a creek and instructed everyone to rest. They would travel only at night, concealing themselves during daylight when they were most likely to be detected. They rationed out small portions of food, cornbread, dried meat, some vegetables. It wasn't substantial, and it wouldn't last long, but it was sufficient for now. As the sun rose over Alabama, casting golden light across the landscape, the fugitives huddled in their hiding place and attempted to sleep. But sleep proved difficult. Every time someone closed their eyes, they visualized the dining hall, visualized the bodies, visualized Elizabeth Cunningham's countenance as she comprehended she had been poisoned. They had killed over 100 people. They had committed murder on a scale that would shock the entire South. And now they were fleeing for their existence. Back at the plantation, morning arrived with terrible discovery. Ruth, one of the enslaved individuals who had remained behind, had risen early, as she always did to commence her work in the laundry. When she noticed that the main house was unusually quiet, she approached cautiously and peered through the window of the dining hall. What she observed made her scream, a sound that echoed across the entire plantation and brought everyone running. Within minutes, the remaining enslaved individuals had gathered outside the main house, staring in horror at the scene visible through the windows. Bodies everywhere. The wedding feast still on the tables, the candles burned down to stubs, and an absolute terrible silence. Someone ran to fetch Pike, the overseer, who resided in a small house at the edge of the property. He arrived within 20 minutes, and when he observed what had occurred, the color drained from his face. He comprehended immediately what this signified. He had been sleeping peacefully while over 100 white people were murdered under his supervision. His existence was effectively concluded. The only question was whether he would hang alongside the enslaved individuals or merely be ruined financially and socially. He dispatched riders immediately to every neighboring plantation, to the sheriff in Selma, to the militia in Montgomery. The news spread like wildfire. The Whitmore plantation had been the site of the largest mass murder in Alabama history. Over 100 white people, including some of the most prominent citizens in the state, had been poisoned at a wedding celebration, and 23 enslaved individuals were missing, presumed to be the perpetrators. By noon, search parties were forming throughout the county. Men grabbed rifles, saddled horses, unleashed bloodhounds. Rewards were posted, $1,000 for information leading to the capture of the fugitives, deceased or alive. The militia was mobilized. Every road, every town, every plantation was placed on alert. The manhunt had commenced. But the fugitives, resting in their concealed thicket 10 miles distant, didn't know any of this yet. They slept fitfully through the hot Alabama day, their rest disturbed by nightmares and the sounds of the forest surrounding them. When evening arrived, and they prepared to resume their journey, they perceived the weight of what they had done settling on their shoulders like a physical burden. Elias gathered them together before they set out again. From this moment forward, he said quietly, "We're going to confront things we cannot imagine. We're going to be hunted. Some of us won't succeed. Some of us will perish in these woods or be captured and hanged or be torn apart by dogs. But we made a decision back there. We chose to fight rather than submit. We chose to be human beings rather than property. And regardless of what occurs now, no one can ever take that from us. Samuel spoke next. We travel collectively. We protect one another. If someone falls behind, we pause and assist them. If we're captured collectively. No one is abandoned, Clara added. And we don't regret what we did. Those individuals in that house, they would have worked us to death without a second thought. They would have separated our families, beaten our children, treated us like animals. What we did was survive. What we did was fight back. And we don't apologize for that. One by one, each person spoke, affirming their commitment to the group, to the journey, to the impossible aspiration of freedom. Even 5-year-old Jacob, held in Delia's arms, appeared to comprehend the solemnity of the moment. When they finished, they formed a circle, hands joined, and for a brief moment, they were not fugitive enslaved individuals fleeing from justice. They were free individuals bound together by choice rather than chains, confronting an uncertain future with courage rather than submission. As darkness descended, they began walking again, heading north guided by the light of the stars. Behind them, the plantation they had known their entire existence faded into the distance. Ahead of them lay 200 miles of danger, hardship, and fear. But they walked with their heads elevated because, for the first time in their existence, they were walking toward something they had chosen for themselves. The journey north would transport them through swamps and forests, across rivers and through towns, past plantations where other enslaved individuals observed them pass with expressions of wonder and dread. They would travel by night and conceal themselves by day. They would experience hunger and cold and exhaustion. They would lose people along the way. Old Moses would die of exhaustion after 50 miles. Isaiah would be shot by a bounty hunter near the Tennessee border. Delia would drown, crossing a river in flood. But the survivors would continue, driven by something more powerful than fear, more powerful even than hope. They would reach Tennessee, and then Kentucky, and finally Ohio. Of the 23 who departed the Whitmore plantation on the night of April 16, 1859, 11 would cross into free territory. 11 individuals who had chosen death over submission, who had retaliated against their oppressors, who had refused to accept that their enslavement was natural or inevitable or divinely ordained. Years later, when the Civil War finally arrived and slavery was abolished, some of those 11 would recount their story. They would speak of the Whitmore plantation, of the wedding feast, of the night when over 100 people perished, because enslaved people decided they would rather be murderers than enslaved individuals. The story would become legend whispered in black communities across the North, a tale of resistance and revenge that both horrified and inspired. But on that first night, as they walked through the darkness toward an uncertain future, they were simply 23 individuals who had made an impossible choice and were experiencing the consequences. They didn't know if they would survive the week, much less achieve freedom. They only knew that they had ceased being victims and had become, for better or worse, architects of their own destiny. And as the sun rose on April 17, 1859, and the search parties spread out across Alabama searching for them, the fugitives rested in a concealed ravine, exhausted, but alive, terrified, but free, understanding that whatever came next, they had already achieved something that many enslaved people never experienced in their entire existence. They had chosen, and no one could ever take that choice from them. The Whitmore plantation would stand vacant for years after that night, a monument to the arrogance of people who believed they could possess other human beings without consequence. The main house would fall into disrepair, its windows broken, its walls crumbling, gradually reclaimed by the Alabama wilderness. Local people would claim it was haunted, that on quiet nights you could still perceive the sound of a wedding celebration, of music and laughter that concluded in sudden, terrible silence. But the truth was simpler and more profound than any ghost story. The Whitmore plantation was haunted not by the deceased who had attended that wedding, but by the living who had served it, by the 67 individuals who had been property, who had been beaten and starved and worked to death, who had been denied every basic human dignity, and by the 23 who had refused, who had risked everything for the slim possibility of freedom, who had chosen to be human beings rather than accept their dehumanization. That was the true haunting. Not the spirits of the oppressors, but the memory of the oppressed who declined to remain silent, who declined to accept injustice, who retaliated with whatever weapons they possessed, even if that weapon was poison, even if the cost was their own existence. And somewhere in the North in free territory, 11 individuals lived to recount the tale. 11 witnesses to a night when enslaved people demonstrated that they were not property, not animals, not objects to be owned and controlled. They were human beings capable of fury and love, of courage and fear, of terrible choices made in impossible circumstances. The world would attempt to forget them, to erase their story, to pretend that slavery was a benign institution where enslaved people were content with their situation. But the empty ruins of the Whitmore plantation stood as a reminder that this was false, that resistance existed even in the darkest circumstances, that the enslaved never accepted their enslavement, even when they had to pretend to for survival. And on quiet nights, when the wind blew through the abandoned rooms of the main house, past tables that would never again hold a feast, through a dining hall that had witnessed both the pinnacle of Southern hospitality and the depths of Southern cruelty, perhaps there was indeed something haunting that place. Not spirits, but memory, the memory of what people will do when pushed beyond the point of endurance. The memory of a choice that could not be undone, the memory of the night when 23 enslaved individuals confronted their oppressors and declared with action rather than words, "No